right, good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie Chen. I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP. It's my great delight to welcome all of you to IIEP and to our special series of International Economic Policy Forum to celebrate IIEP's 10-year anniversary. As many of you know, IIEP was founded by my colleague, Professor Mike Moore, 10 years and 2 months ago, 2 years after I arrived at GW. Unfortunately, Mike cannot be here today, but I still remember the conversation I had with him 10 years ago, actually 11 years ago, about the idea of founding this new platform at the Elliott School. And I remember Mike saying to me, Maggie, this is going to be a great opportunity to get funding to organize a couple of conferences each year. So as a new assistant professor, right, that was enough said. And my eyes started beaming, and I said to him, cool, coming in. So 10 years later, right, under the leadership of my predecessors, some of them in the room, Stephen, IIEP has grown from a group of 7 faculty affiliates to a leading research institute with 50 faculty experts from over 10 disciplines, right? And IIEP started with 2 major conferences every year in the beginning, with the first one being on microfinance, organized by Professor Smith, to about 50 events and hundreds of speakers every year, ranging from leading scholars, Nobel Prize winners, and international organization leaders. And our work has now spanned across from poverty reduction, global economic governance, to climate change adaptation and US-China relations. In the meanwhile, we have arrived at, as many of you would say, a rather chaotic and uncertain time of international economic policy, as we face unprecedented divisions, both economic and social divisions, within and across our societies. And as many governments begin to look backward when they are confronted with domestic problems and reverse a lot of the progresses that have been made in the last decade. So some may say, this is, really chaotic time, but in my view, the uncertainties and the chaos are precisely what underscores what IIEP is working at the value and importance of IIEP's work. In fact, as we march into the second decade, IIEP already had a full schedule. In the last 2 months, we had a hugely successful 5th conference on urbanization, the 10th conference on US-China economic relations. We had a leadership thought leadership event on digital economy in Africa. We had an annual research conference on international trade, and we have our inaugural executive education program, which attracted a large cohort of business executives from China. And today, we're here to launch our special series of International Economic Forum with our inaugural speaker, Dr. Louise Fox, the chief economist of USAID, to address some of the most pressing issues in front of us, starting with youth employment. I'll leave it to my colleague, Stephen, to introduce Louise and her work. But thank you, Louise, for coming and joining us today. I also want to thank everyone in the audience, my colleagues, our amazing alumni, students, and supporters, all of our staff, and of course, last but not least, my boss, for supporting IIEP's work. I'm excited and confident that going forward, IIEP will continue to build excellence and make profound impacts. So now I would like to welcome my boss, the Dean of the Elliott School, Ambassador Ruben Brigitte, for sharing remarks with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maggie. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Ambassador Ruben Brigitte. I'm the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs, and it really is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the first in a special series of International Economic Policy Fora in celebration of the 10th anniversary of the International Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP. This special series of fora will feature leading economic policymakers and business officials. And over the last 10 years, IIEP, as Maggie has said, has established itself as the leading academic research institute focused on global economic and development issues. IIEP consists of over 50 faculty experts across 10 different disciplines who make substantial contributions to great policy challenges facing the globe. These include the measurement and alleviation of ultra poverty, adaptation to climate change, and sustainable climate finance, as well as global economic governance in the 21st century. From a regional perspective, IIEP focuses on the countries and regions with greatest potential impact on the future of the global economy: China, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The importance of this work has been highlighted by its incorporation into policy at the International Financial Institutions, or the IIFES, the U.S. governmental agencies, and the United Nations. And I invite you to continue to engage with IIEP as we move forward into our second decade, which will be in our third and our fourth, beyond that. This evening, I'm delighted that we will feature an address focused on an area of deep interest to our work here at the Elliott School, that of youth empowerment and youth employment. As some of you may know, we are in the midst of establishing the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice, or LEAP Academy, with a focus on developing the brightest minds of today into the most impactful leaders of tomorrow. It is thus with great pleasure that we welcome Louise Fox, Chief Economist at USAID, to share her ongoing work on youth employment with us. Now let me take a break from my established remarks to tell you a little something secret. I love USAID. It's true. It was my first civilian job in government was working as a special assistant in the Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance under then President Bush, with Henrietta Fore as the USAID administrator at the time. In my view, most Americans don't fully realize what a gem we have in USAID, and we're thrilled that we have the opportunity to have Louise here to share her thoughts with us this evening. Understanding how to train and develop the best and brightest students from around the globe is at the core of what we do here at the Elliott School, preparing leaders to take on the toughest challenges the world has to offer. Louise has long been focused on the development of youth around the globe, and in particular in Africa, a place that is particularly near and dear to my heart, including in her most recent book entitled Youth Employment in Sub-Saharan Africa, which was published by the World Bank in 2014. During my tenure as the U.S. Ambassador to the African Union, I saw firsthand the need to better understand the linkages between education and employment, and I'm grateful for the work that Louise and USAID are undertaking to ensure that the future generations have an even greater opportunities than currently exist. Now I'd like to welcome to the podium Stephen Smith, a professor of economics and international affairs. Hang on one second, just yet. Whose research focuses on development economics broadly and the economics of poverty alleviation in particular. Stephen will introduce Louise and moderate the Q&A portion of her talk. Let me also apologize. I would love to be able to stay for your talk, but I have Boy Scout meeting tonight. And as an assistant scoutmaster, it's really quite important that I be there. So Steve, the floor is yours. Louise, thank you very much for coming.
We promised to make the video available so that everybody can catch up who may not be able to be here. So really, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Louise Fox, the Chief Economist of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Dr. Fox guides USAID on economics-based decision-making and is responsible for keeping USAID's economists on the cutting edge of ideas in development economics. Before joining USAID, Dr. Fox was visiting professor of development economic policy at UC Berkeley, and she has taught courses here at GW, so we're glad to welcome you back. Dr. Fox had a distinguished career at the World Bank, where she advised governments in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe on how to develop, implement, and evaluate effective policies for employment, social security, and poverty reduction. Her most recent publications include work on poverty reduction and inclusive growth, employment, labor markets, and labor regulation, all with respect to sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Fox has also published on pension reform, reform of child welfare systems, social protection, public expenditures, female-headed households, stabilization, social costs of adjustment, and I have left out a number of other areas of important contributions in the interest of time. As the Dean mentioned, Dr. Fox's most recent book is Youth Employment in Sub-Saharan Africa, which was published by the World Bank in 2014, in which we heard your presentation on some, I guess 3 years ago. Today, we are going to hear about her report, The Evidence is in How Should Youth Employment Programs in Low-Income Countries Be Designed. I can't think of a more topical issue and problem. So Dr. Fox, welcome back to George Washington University.
Well, it is great to be here. And I did teach for a semester here in the Elliott School. I was kind of in transition in the process of leaving the World Bank and thinking, what should I do? And IIEP said, why don't you teach economics here? And I thought, okay, I'll give it a try out and see if I like academia. And I did. But I'm afraid then I went on to Berkeley because that's my home state. But I did enjoy very much teaching here, and I felt like the students asked me very interesting questions, questions that I might not have thought of, and questions that perhaps governments or other people I talked with hadn't asked me. So I recommend it to my colleagues also that they try the experience. Okay, so then I went to California, that's right, and tried to live a quiet life as an academic, and then my government called. It was, shall we say, before the most recent election, and I thought, okay, I've never worked for the U.S. government. I should give it a try. After the election, I thought, am I still going to give it a try? But I thought, okay, what have I got to lose? Let's just give it a try. And I think I have to tell you, it's been a great experience, actually. It's different than any place I've worked with before. But I agree with the ambassador. USAID's a great organization. It's full of a lot of bright people who are passionate about development and about developing countries, and that helps me go to work every day, to work with people who have that passion. So I am a labor economist, poverty economist, household behavior economist, and when they interviewed me for this job, they asked me, I told them I wasn't a macroeconomist. My two predecessors were macroeconomists, and they were both named Steve. Maybe you could have had the job, but anyway, I didn't change my name to Stevie, and I told them I wasn't a macroeconomist either. And they said, yes, we know that, but we need some help in our work on employment. And I came to USAID and I thought, yeah, they're right. Everybody's trying to work on employment. It seems to be a big issue that everybody's thinking about. And the question is, what are they doing, and do they know the evidence? So together with Upasana Paul, who's in the audience here, we did this paper to kind of summarize the evidence. It kind of builds on the work that I did on sub-Saharan Africa, and to say, okay, here's some implications for programming. So that's what I'm going to present to you today. Now, there have been a number of there have been two other papers recently published, at least, actually three now that I think about it. And why a fourth? Okay, so two of those dealt with a mixture of low-income, middle-income, and high-income countries. And I think that's kind of a mishmash. Developing countries are different, as I'm going to argue, and their labor markets are different, their institutions are different, and they pose, therefore, different challenges. So that excludes two papers. Then one other paper only dealt with part of the problem by David McKinsey at the World Bank, and he just really dealt with sort of what he called active labor market programs, which were sort of more about training programs. Ambitiously, Upasana and I decided to cover the whole gamut. Programs, training programs, other programs to help youth enter into employment, and also programs to increase labor demand, which nobody else covered. So I'm going to run through, we reviewed, I don't know how many hundreds of studies, I lost count. I'm going to try to run through that evidence for you on what it is and I think what it means for policy. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk about. I think most other reviews didn't bring a conceptual framework that I bring to the problem. The conceptual framework I bring is around structural transformation, and we talk about theories of change, and then we talk about the evidence, and then we talk about what we need to think about now. You will not be surprised to hear, as a researcher, I call for further research. Okay, so the first point is that the employment opportunities for youth are not going to be that much different than the employment opportunities for non-youth adults in the country. And this is an important point which is often kind of missed, right? So if you're in a low-income country, let's think about, well, Ethiopia is a pretty low-income country, or Rwanda, or even, I don't think in Southeast Asia anyone's a low-income country anymore, but, you know, Laos maybe, I don't, okay, maybe, I thought it was gotten rich off the dam, but anyway, you know, the share of the people in wage employment is pretty small. And this includes public and private, right? So that 19% rectangle up there is public and private. And so if you decide to start a program to help youth enter into wage employment, you are catering to the elite. That's the first point. And then as you get richer, there is more wage employment. Why does this happen? Well, what characterizes poor countries? What characterizes poor countries is production takes place in households farms and household firms. As countries get richer, more production moves into firms. Enterprises are the most efficient economic organization known today. Enterprises, work moves into firms, production moves into firms, workers follow, workers are more productive, they get higher wages, and there is more wage employment. And so the characteristic of low and lower middle income countries is they don't have enough firms because they don't have enough private investment for a whole bunch of reasons, including that they may not have the infrastructure and the institutions to make that private investment pay off. And as a result, and it'll take time for them to get there. And therefore, they don't have that many wage jobs. So if your focus is, as most programs are in low-income countries, in urban areas to help youth enter into wage employment, you're really not dealing with the majority of the people in the labor force, and you're not dealing with the majority of places where youth are going to work. And the next point I want to make is, given this employment structure, what does the labor market look like, and what is the effect of, say, a training program? So the classical labor market is what I would have taught you, of course, in economics and in basic economics class, right? And there you have your demand curve and your supply curve, and the demand curve for labor, of course, slopes down because, you know, that's the way it is when wages go up. They hire less, right? And the supply curve slopes up because, of course, with more wages, more people want to work. So what happens if we do a so-called supply-side program, a training program, we expand the supply, an education program, whatever it is. We expand the supply of educated labor who are prepared to enter into the labor market and qualify for a job in those firms. So the classical labor market, what we think about happens is that you see the green line, the supply curve moves out, and that means that more people are hired but at a lower wage. if the wages don't fall, then you may have unemployment. If the demand curve moves out at the same time as the supply curve, which is what tends to happen in a growing economy, then you just have more people employed at about the same rate or maybe more, depending on how the demand curves and the supply curves move out. Now, of course, there isn't one labor market, right? You could think about a different labor market for different levels of education or something. But this is an entry labor market, right? And at entry level, people are kind of pretty much the same as far as a firm's concerned, right? Okay, you graduate, you got a BA, little experience. Okay, you're the same as everybody else, right? So the firm is indifferent on who they hire. They just want to hire enough people that they can afford at that wage. Now, what's different? Okay, so maybe that does this sort of classical labor market doesn't even exist in developed countries, and of course, and we can discuss a whole bunch of reasons why, including maybe wages don't fall and da 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 da. But it certainly doesn't exist in developing country labor markets. Why? Remember, I told you there's a shortage of firms. So what do we have? Okay, so why is the wage rate here like this on this picture here? Why is this part flat where it wasn't flat in the other picture? Well, the reason it's flat is, and it could be flat, by the way, in developed countries as well, but the reason it's flat is that it costs money to go to work, right? You have to earn enough money to be able to pay the bus fare and to be able to buy food and to be able to, or maybe you walk to work, but you still have to buy food and you have to have some clothes and you have to bring the money home and take care of your family and whatever. And so you're not going to work for less than that because it doesn't pay for you to go to work. You can, after all, farm or have a household business or whatever. You could also have a minimum wage. That would be what an economy would look like with a minimum wage, right? So, and the demand for labor is, again, this red line. Now, what happens? What happens is we've got a lot more workers who qualify for the job than there are firms that are demanding those workers because there's a shortage of firms. And so what happens is rectangle A is the people who get employment, right? Rectangle B are the people who don't get employment. Now, the firm is indifferent between rectangle A and rectangle B. They just, employ the people in their queue who meet their basic tests, like you show up a couple days and you have the certificates or whatever, and so they hire them. And what happens to rectangle B? Well, in a low and lower middle income country, they certainly don't become unemployed. In a lower middle income country, if their parents can support them and are somewhat rich, they might become unemployed. But for the most part, they then go back to that household production sector. They go work in, if they're in an urban area, they start their own self-employment business, their kiosk or their this or their that, they're selling this or they're making this or whatever. So along comes a development project run by the development NGO. We won't have it run by USAID today. Run by a development NGO. And they say, wow, look at these youth and they're not working and we're going to train them. And maybe they dropped out of school, so we're going to give them extra training so they finish school. And we're gonna give them an apprenticeship in the firm and we're going to really get them ready for work. Well, that's great. Okay, so now the supply curve, which was here, moves out to here. Okay? Now, the demand curve didn't move, though, because we haven't had any new investments, so there's still the same amount of firms. So what we did was we created more people who are competing for the same job. And so we substituted the people that we trained for the people that were hired, would have been hired anyway. We redistributed the jobs between Group A, Group B, and the new Group C. Economists call that displacement, okay? We displaced someone. We did not create any new jobs. Was the money well spent? Well, that depends on your objective. Now, if you think youth employment is more important than adult employment, or women's employment is more important than men's employment, or something like that, then you did something good. Okay, you put the man or the older person or the adult supporting 5 kids or whatever out of work, or they didn't get a job in the first place, but you got the youth employed, or you got the woman employed, or whoever you dealt with, the person from the rural areas or whoever you dealt with, you got them employed. And actually the problem is we never really know who didn't get the job. Our monitoring system said 60% of the people who completed the program got a job, but we don't know who didn't get a job, who would have. We never know. So this kind of redistribution, it can be justified as redistribution. So people talk about programs in South Africa for disadvantaged youth. Okay, after a history of apartheid, I'm with them on redistribution. That makes sense, especially given the quality of the schools that many people from disadvantaged areas go to. So I'm kind of with them on that, okay? But in general, we have to think about, why are we doing redistribution? And we have to think, who are these youth? Many people say, oh, we're helping disadvantaged youth. These so-called disadvantaged youth who finish secondary school are not disadvantaged in Kenya. They're actually only the top 20% of the students. So from the richest families, right? So although someone who only completed secondary school here would be considered disadvantaged, they're not disadvantaged in Kenya or wherever. Okay, so what I'm going to argue is that most of the programs that are done for youth employment in low and lower middle income countries do not succeed anyway. They don't even get that 60%, right? And the ones who succeed, of the ones that succeed in terms of wage employment, evidence is coming in to suggest that there is a lot of displacement happening. Okay. So what did we do? We looked at projects, and we kind of classified them according to supply side or business climate. Now, most of the projects are designed to help people get into wage employment. There are some projects that are designed to create wage employment. There are some projects that are also designed to help people, youth, get into self-employment. Because remember, the youth problem is entry into employment. Everybody needs to make a living, okay? So earnings is not a problem specific to youth. The youth problem is entry into employment and into some kind of stable livelihood, not just like working one day and then going back home. That's not entry into employment, right? But some kind of regular livelihood. All right, so theories of change are now popular. You open up a project document, they all have theories of change, right? We don't talk about causality, we talk about theories of change. But there are key assumptions in these projects. And the point is that the assumption behind many of the supply side projects, of which the majority of youth projects in low and lower middle income countries are, is that entry-level vacancies exist, but youth lack the skills to get them. Now, an alternative theory of change might be that the only way we're going to get more youth employed is to increase the demand for youth labor, so to fix factors out of the control of youth. Our point is that very often projects don't really check that assumption. They don't check that entry-level vacancies exist, but youth lack the skills to get them. Or they don't check which skills youth lack. They don't check to see if it's because they didn't learn to read and write in school. They don't check to see whether it's so-called non-cognitive skills or whether it's actually the vocational skills that they're teaching. They don't check that. And so they just start doing a training program. And so our argument is that people need to look at these theories of change. Okay, so now I'm starting on the results. These are results from impact evaluations. The design had to be experimental or quasi-experimental. So that means somebody had a control group, right? And so here are the key results. Now, these are the results of programs that try to get youth into wage employment. Let me say that of the programs we reviewed, at some point we have to count how many programs we actually reviewed, but I know it's over 100. Two covered rural areas. 2. All the rest were urban. Okay, now it's true that at this point, almost 50% of the population in developing countries is in urban areas, and that's going to increase. In sub-Saharan Africa, that's still not true, though. So all of this work is going on in urban areas. Okay, if it's red, that means there was no impact. If it's blue, that means there was a little bit of impact. If it's green, that means their impact. You can see there's a lot of red and a lot of blue and a bit of green. And you'll also see that for some countries, there's green and red, because in some cases, the program looked like it had an impact in the short right after the program was done, or a year after the program was done, and then 4 or 5 years after the program was done, somebody went back and surveyed and it didn't have an impact. Okay, now, remember I talked about the different kind of skills, right? So there, it turns out that actually if you ask firms, I know this is true for sub-Saharan Africa. I actually haven't myself done the research in Asia, but certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, if you ask firms what skills are lacking among the youth that they want to hire, it is not the skills that are being taught here, the TVET, technical and vocational skills. It is what we call the so-called non-cognitive skills, what Heckman calls character skills. We need them to show up to work on time. We need them to be able to work in teams. We need them to persevere. Self-regulation, self-determination. I'm learning these psychological words, right? The big five, the psychologists call them. Okay, so then why don't programs that teach life skills only work? That's quite a puzzle. Answer, well, the one in Kenya was only 2 weeks. I mean, maybe, what was that? And the one in Jordan was interesting. It was for, actually nothing in Jordan worked for females. These programs in Jordan were for women who graduated from university and none of them worked. It's a sad story, Jordan. So that's a whole nother story. Now, when I started working in sub-Saharan Africa at the World Bank, what I was told was, best practice. You give people vouchers. Let them choose their technical and vocational training. They will only choose things that would pay off. Okay, some bright guys by the name of Michael Kramer and Ted Miguel checked this in Kenya. They've had a study going for almost 10 years. They still can't find any effect of giving people vouchers for technical and vocational. Public, private, whatever, they can't find an effect. Turkey couldn't find effect. Turkey's not a developed, not a low-income country, but it's in there anyway. And in India, there was a small effect for females only. So now we have these composite programs, TVET plus life skills plus work experience. We're talking about internships or apprenticeships or whatever. And those do seem to have some effect. Okay, why don't we just do those? Well, there are a couple things. One, when somebody tells me a composite program had an effect, I want to know, okay, well, which part had an effect? Well, we don't know. We just threw everything at them and something stuck and we don't know what it is. All right? And of course, what they called life skills is very heterogeneous. The training they were doing was very heterogeneous. Also, with the exception of Nepal, these programs are really expensive. These programs cost $1,500, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a person. These programs that succeeded were run by NGOs, and they included an apprenticeship in the firm where the NGO paid them a stipend, et cetera, et cetera. And that's great, but that's not going to scale up. That's kind of a boutique program. Some of them, I call them the graduate student program, because some of them are run by or monitored by graduate students. And with the exception of Nepal, the Nepal program is the Nepal Employment Program. That's $500 a participant. Now, I'm not sure what share of the participants were already working. A substantial share were already working, so it's kind of like skilling up people who were already working. That may be why it's cheaper. That's not really entry into employment, but that's another story. And then, of course, an ICT program in Kenya. Why did that work? Well, ICT... Oops, I'm going the wrong way. ICT is an example where that red line's moving out. If you have a sector, right, where wages are increasing, you know the demand curve is moving out. If the demand curve is moving out, then you haven't got enough people, and you got a lot of firms. And so maybe it's a good idea to do this training, and maybe the firm would even pay for some of it, which is another story. Firms pay for training. Okay, what else? Job fairs didn't work in Ethiopia and the Philippines. This is career day matching, whatever. Recruitment services, this is for young women in rural India to recruit them into call centers. That worked. Apprentice matching, transport subsidies. In Bangladesh, it worked to get people from rural areas to go work in urban areas, but in Ethiopia, it didn't work. And then wage subsidies in South Africa worked a little bit, but actually nobody took up the wage subsidies. So I sort of consider them almost like a way to get the person in the front of the queue. What do I conclude from all of this? Well, now, who tested for displacement? Almost nobody. There's a study that's not listed here in Uganda where they did test for displacement, and they found TVET worked with 100% displacement. Okay, now the Ghana apprenticeship matching tested for displacement and didn't find displacement, and that was quite interesting. So again, there may be a friction in the labor market there, which that program is solving. So it's not like there's nothing that can be done, right, to solve information problems or whatever. It's just that a lot of these programs are expensive and not really working. Okay. Now we have demand-side interventions. What can I say about these demand-side interventions? These are interventions to get firms to hire more workers. These are not youth-specific, but my own research has shown, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, that when wage employment expands among youth, it expands among non-youth. So if you take the two age groups and you put the share of the age group in wage employment on one axis and the other on the other axis, and you plot the points, you get about a 45-degree line. So I'm fairly confident about these. Now, what do we learn from this? I would summarize this as saying, first of all, there's been a lot more work than this on firms, okay? But most of it focuses on firm profits and revenues, not on employment. It's only recently that people have started looking for an employment effect. So what I would summarize this as saying, number one, what seems to work best is for what goes in bigger firms. Now that kind of makes sense because we know there's a lot, small firms and micro enterprises, there's a lot of churning. They go out of business, they come back, they go out of business, they come back. So it makes sense. Some of these services are expensive, but they can pay off in medium and large firms. So microcredit doesn't work, but larger loans to larger enterprises does increase employment, okay? And like general entrepreneurship training doesn't work, but more expensive business development services and consulting actually helps. Generic kind of financial literacy courses don't really work, but more specific business consulting has been shown to help. Registration and business formalization doesn't work for microenterprises in Sri Lanka, but it works for new larger firms in Argentina and Brazil. And then, of course, wage subsidies worked in Mexico for bigger firms. This was in a time of, this is one of those subsidies in a time of recession where they basically paid part of the wages so that the firms could keep the workers. And those firms that got the subsidies obviously kept the employment during the period of subsidy, but beyond increased employment faster. Okay, so big firms, that's not surprising. Big firms hire a lot of people too, so that's good. So I think if we want to solve the youth employment problem, let's start trying to get more big firms, more big labor-intensive firms to make investments. Okay, so now what about the rest of, remember my picture over here on, what about all of these people in the red rectangle and the green rectangle at the bottom? What about them? Okay, so I call those household enterprises as distinguished from, you know, employers, right? People who are real entrepreneurs, who are growth-oriented, who employ a number of people. This is self-employment, household businesses, whatever. And this is, remember, where the majority of the people work. Now, there's not very much here on agriculture. There's one study on agriculture by Chris Blattman in Liberia to try to get mobilized soldiers into agriculture, and it worked. But that's it for agriculture. That's all we got. That and farmer field schools, which don't work. So there we are. Okay, so once again, TVET only didn't work. It worked a little bit in Kenya for female only. This is the Nepal employment program again that worked. In Malawi, apprenticeships alone didn't work. Oh, it was apprenticeship plus some classroom. In Uganda, this is the famous Northern Uganda program that worked. The effect was stronger for males. That may have been because it was a post-conflict situation. But, you know, what I would really like to highlight here is that what worked, and by the way, micro enterprise doesn't help existing firms hire more workers, but it does help people start up. So it is relevant for the youth problem. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on microenterprise. It does help youth startup. But you know what I want to highlight? Cash helps too. And cash is really cheap. You know what? So this study on Kenya about micro-franchising versus cash, Owen Ozier at the World Bank did it, and along with some others. And he said to me that about, like, this was in Nairobi, young women aged about 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, somewhere around there. And he said, you know, Louise, I called these women in, and they said they were interested in micro-franchising. And then I said, okay, sorry, only you guys get to micro-franchise, and you guys are just going to get some cash and nothing else, no training, no nothing. And you guys, sorry, you're not going to get anything. You didn't win the lottery, right? So of the people who got cash, she said like 99% of them showed up to get the cash. Of the people who were selected for the micro-franchising, where the training was going to start in 2 weeks, and they said already they were ready for the micro-franchising, right? Like 25% of them didn't even show up on the first day. So cash works. It works as well as more expensive things, and it has a higher take-up. Now, some of these cash grants get combined with what I call business skills. But in the case of Nicaragua, for example, it was a one-day business plan. In the case of Ethiopia, I think it was 1 week, the ILO's Start Your Business kind of program. So, and in Uganda, I think it was also 1 week. And so I'm really not sure whether you actually need those things or not. The Uganda, we really don't know. A lot of people think you shouldn't just give people cash. You got to give them this training or something. And again, we go back to, we don't know what this training is doing. Maybe it just puts them in a room and says, okay, you got to do some planning before we give you the cash. And maybe it's just that process. Again, teaching them a transferable, a soft skill. So again, we really don't know. I want to highlight that the Life Skills Mentorship and Business Skills Program, Uganda Brock, that one is $100 a participant. This is an after-school program. Now, in a way, I almost don't care how it works. It's pretty cost-effective. And this one, but again, this is an after-school program which focuses primarily on soft skills, non-cognitive skills. It replaces the ones that they're not learning in school. And it also gives them some support to think about doing something different with their life, perhaps, than their mother or their grandmother did. And it's pretty effective. And so, and it has, to the extent that it has vocational training, because people, they may ask for some vocational training, it lasts 2 weeks. It's really cheap. The whole thing is just really cheap. So I think we have some ideas I sort of think there's an argument made by these people who work for Give Directly that cash should be sort of our hurdle or a benchmark. If a program can't do better than cash, chuck it. Don't use it. And they're actually testing some of these, one youth employment program in Rwanda against cash. And I guess we'll know the results in about 3 years, 4 years, because that's how long these impact evaluations take. But I have a feeling what I'm betting on. I'm betting on the cash. Okay, so now I haven't talked a lot about gender, and I think the issue on gender is complicated. There are a couple new studies that have come in since we did these slides. There's another study that you've probably seen. It's not about youth, but Marcus Goldstein and others did it at the World Bank. It was recently published in Science. And they gave people, traditional business training versus soft skills training. And it's the soft skills training that paid off in terms of more profits and earnings for their business. Why? Because the people who got the soft skills training could teach themselves the business schools training, but they also knew how to solve management problems and negotiate with suppliers and whatever. And there's another program in Argentina, which I discuss in the paper, where they gave only soft skills and vocational. And the soft skills, nothing worked for men, and both things worked for women. But the point is, the soft skills only worked for women, and the ones who got the soft skills only were also happier, apparently. So there's obviously some issues around gender norms and culture where various things that people do under the rubric of soft skills, life skills, safe spaces, social support, whatever, that those work. So then there are training programs that have found a gender effect for higher for women or better for women than men, and vice versa. Most of those programs actually didn't test the significance of the difference of the coefficients, and if they tested it, they probably wouldn't have found it was that much different, partly because they have a small sample size and partly because it wasn't that much different. So I think that we need to be careful. There is a urban legend, shall we say, going around that training is really important for young women. And I think it's maybe not the content of the training, but maybe just the fact that it's a program. Maybe the certification matters. So I think we have to be, we need to know a lot more. And, what we really need to know a lot more about is what's needed, what works and why, and what's cost effective. Because that's another question, is what's cost effective. These expensive programs, how could a program that costs $1,500 a participant scale up in Liberia? Great experiment, but another one of these graduate student-run programs. Okay, so here are my implications. We need more research on how youth succeed. We need to know what pathways they follow. We need to know the bumps along the road and how they overcame them. We need some more qualitative research, maybe before we do any more expensive impact evaluations. Maybe we should try to spend more time understanding that kind of stuff. We need to know, so there is some research that suggests that youth do not know about their economic opportunities. So in West Africa, they did some research. They asked youth what they expected what job they expected to get when they graduated from secondary school and what they expected to pay. And their idea of what it would pay was about 50 to 200% more than it would actually pay. Okay, so then I asked the authors of the study, I said, well, who could influence their thinking? How come that happens? Because it doesn't happen in China that people don't know what jobs pay. They know what jobs pay. But somehow their knowledge doesn't always transfer, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So who could influence their thinking? As I said, we need to know a lot more about rural areas. Rural areas were just kind of empty on that. And this is important at USAID because we do a lot of work in rural areas. USAID has the Global Food Security Strategy. They want to incorporate employment benchmarks. They want to target youth, but they don't know what to do. They asked me what to do. They said, Louise, you've been studying this for a while. I said, nothing in rural areas. We don't have that research. So we got to do that. I think we need more information from firms on the real skill constraints and also on their human resource processes and why they don't get better. What we do find is that firms often do train. But what we also find is that firms talk about having big turnover. And Chris Blattman and Stefan Durkan have documented that in Ethiopia. And my question is, if a firm is having, 80% of the workers leaving in the first 2 weeks that they hire entry level, why don't they change what they're doing? So there's clearly, this goes back to the management processes that may not be good. And if the skill shortage is in an area where a low-income country is unlikely to have. Like, if you take a country with a young labor force and you say, I want a skilled X, I want an experienced X. Well, there aren't many experienced X because the average age of the labor force is about 25, right? So no experienced X. Okay, so why don't we convince countries to import the experienced X from somewhere else in return for those experienced X doing more training or helping the firm get recruited. I think we need to try more digital for self-employment. I think we need Airbnb and TaskRabbit. I think we need TaskRabbit for digital employment and self-employment in low-income countries. Everyone knows what TaskRabbit is, right? You know, you're the right age. Some audiences I say it to, they don't know what it is, but okay. And I'm wondering, like, why don't we connect this to microfinance or something so that they can get a loan based on a performance? And I met a guy who's actually trying to structure that in Nairobi. And of course, because the problem is you hire a skilled tradesman like once a year or whatever, and they probably overcharge you because you have no idea what it should cost. But of course, when it's on TaskRabbit, people bid, and then you start getting an idea of the average cost for a job, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's what we should be investing. But most importantly, we should stop thinking that supply creates its own demand. So I'm going to end with a quote from Lindsay Wallace, of the research director of the MasterCard Foundation. The MasterCard Foundation is one of the biggest funders of youth programs in low-income countries. And this was the quote that she did introducing a study that they did of youth in Ghana and Kenya, and whether any programs were reaching them and whether they were working. And the answer was no. And so they called that study Invisible Lives. So MasterCard Foundation says, obviously we need to rethink things. And I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much. Yes, I'll take questions. Do you want me to stand up there or?
Yes, I think that's a good idea if you would. And we have a microphone that can be passed around, or even two. Thank you. So I think we have at least 20, maybe 25 minutes for questions. Perhaps just to start the conversation going, I might ask you a couple of things that were stimulated by what you had to say. Well, just kind of start with your first couple of slides. The first one showing the very large informal sector in developing countries. Of course, that's where we have to start with low-income countries. I'm reminded here that just about a year ago, Mohammed Yunus, the founder of the Grameen Bank, came to spend the day here with us at GW, and you probably know Professor Yunus, and he said that we know that all of these people are born entrepreneurs. Otherwise, they wouldn't be alive today, right? So he had a vision that out of the microfinance and other kinds of support for the micro enterprises, you'd have a different kind of economy. And so, what, if any, light does the referring to the 100+ studies that you have done, what kind of light does it shed on that possibility. Of course,
Well-
knowing, as you said, that most of us in this part of the world like to have regular jobs with secure high incomes.
So if everybody's, okay, so employers are that blue square. That's the share of the labor force, and they're about 2%. They get to be about 4% in high income countries. Now that varies by country. In some countries it's as much, some upper middle income countries even it's 4%. But it's not much above that. These are the people that actually employ somebody. So if all the rest of the people are born entrepreneurs, why aren't they employing anybody? Now, I've written about the answer to that, and there are many answers to that. Let's see. How can I trust them? And variants of that, meaning I don't have the management skills to manage them and to set up the systems so that I know that I can depend on them to do the work and to do it honestly and correctly and promptly, et cetera, right? The only people I can trust are in my family, so I can't expand beyond my family. There are other reasons beyond that. I don't feel like taking a risk. It would be too risky. I can't risk all my family's capital. I have to invest some of it in agriculture and some of it in this, or I have to, whatever. So there are a number of different reasons why everybody is not born an entrepreneur. And so people have called this informal sector group, which is this group here, people have called those subsistence entrepreneurs. I think it's better just not to call them not to confuse things by calling them entrepreneurs, and I just call them in terms of household enterprises. So now, what I would say to Mr. Yunus is that it is true that the review by Banerjee and blah 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 of 6 microcredit programs showed significant positive effects on startup. So there's no question for startup, cash or finance is a constraint, or savings or savings is a constraint. And so that's one reason why cash helps, and that's one reason why microcredit helps. So I'm with him on startups, but so maybe microcredit is not the answer for everybody, but it doesn't actually help them grow the business. So it's not the answer for all problems of development, but let's not throw it out. That's what I would say to Mr. Yunus.
Terrific answer, and says a lot in terms of how we have balance in economic perspectives here. I hope that we might have some chance. I see a lot of hands are up.
So
but
we can take a number of questions if
yeah,
you want.
we can take a number of questions. So why don't we just start maybe on this side of the room and perhaps take 3 questions, and then we will move forwards. Fred, you would like to start perhaps?
Thanks very much for the wonderful presentation, Phil. I'm going to use this too. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. As a bit of background, I've done some of this work in sub-Saharan Africa related to the non-renewable resource sector and looking at local content and training and so forth. And from what you were saying, have you tried to, say, match up where it's possible the IGC firm survey data by country with the programs by country, because that gives you your demand side talking about this.
Are you referring to the Sutton maps?
Yeah, I think it's the Sutton maps.
Okay.
It's from
Yeah.
LSE and
Yeah.
whatnot, where they survey skills and capacity by firms and employment by firms. So you have some idea of who's there and what they can do. It might be some way to match up with this. And then along the other sense, when you're doing these evaluations and so forth, like you mentioned, say, Tanzania or Uganda, when they do these training programs, the people who set them up, do they actually take into account the cultural aspects of what's going on. I mean, you know, you talk about Jordan where women are trained, but then they don't have jobs. Well, there's very good reasons for that, and it doesn't have to do with their skills. Um, are the training programs, do they have problems with seasonality? You have a training program, and then as soon as the program ends, well, it's harvest time. Nobody's going to get a job in one of these non-agricultural firms. I had a whole bunch, but I'll let other people.
Well, I think that may be 3 questions. So I said we take 3 questions together, and they were kind of complex and nuanced. So why don't we let Dr. Fox address that point first, if you'd like to.
No, but my co-author is used to work at the IGC, Upasna, and we didn't. You know, we were looking at the impact evaluations and what they showed. So we didn't have enough evaluations per country to make it really worth delving into that country. So I think those firm surveys are really interesting and they show very interesting things, but it doesn't change the fact that you still have a shortage of firms. Upasna, do you want to add something? Here's.
Right? And in many ways, I think it backs up a lot of what we find and a lot of what Louise pointed out in that the firms that you see in places like Ethiopia and Tanzania, where he did the first enterprise maps, that were particularly successful, they are big firms that are part of the trading networks and are export firms. Those aren't firms that started off as like small mom and pop shops and grew. Those are systemically firms that started off very big and then entered into the export markets, right? They're large formal firms. So that's the first piece, right? So it's this idea that everybody's not going to become a large scale entrepreneur and grow firms, right? The second thing is a lot of John Sutton's work that looks at the local content unit is particularly interesting because he sort of talks about the role of a couple things. One is the importance of having large scale FDI that comes into these countries to attract investment and large foreign firms. But the training piece that he refers to is like firm finance training that comes from large multinational firms that come in and want to have, high quality standards for car safety or car seat manufacturing and things like that. So that's quite different to the kinds of employment opportunities you're going to get. But he does point at the value of having youth enter these kinds of training opportunities because you're not dealing with, years of training in a supply chain somewhere. They're fresh, new minds that want to learn new skills and things like that. But
You need plumbers, you need carpenters.
absolutely.
Okay, but plumbers and carpenters weren't in Sutton's large firm. I think
Yeah,
that's
he looks
important.
at very large, sort of global value
And
chains.
so there is a whole informal apprenticeship market that gives you plumbers and electricians and whatever and people who fix cars, and that whole informal apprenticeship market exists. It's not covered very much in very many of these studies because those aren't the kind of programs that donors tend to run because they're already being run and working. And so the question is, why don't we just kind of leave that alone and let it keep working, and then maybe put in a TaskRabbit so that when the people leave it, they can find work after they're done, and maybe a cash grant to help them buy the tools they need or something. Now, on the, there are. Every time I present this, well, not every time I present, but often, especially when I present it to practitioners, USAID contractors that do training, partners, they ask, well, Louise, did you control for the quality of the training? And of course I can't because I'm this is like hundreds of studies, I can't. And so obviously their view is like if the training was good enough, then it would be okay. So the article that I referred to that's not in the paper that just came out from Imran Rasul and a number of other people associated with the IGC and the LSE and whatever, got the best training people in Uganda. And they tested the people before and after, and the people got skills, and the people got jobs. That's the one that found 100% displacement. That's what I have to say about the quality.
All right, we'll take a couple more, you, and then Carmela.
Thank you, madam. I'm a student here in the Elliott School, and before I was here, I was research assistant for Justin Lin, the former chief economist in World Bank. I worked with him on Chinese investment project in Nigeria. I guess that's also a low-income country. And during our contact with those Chinese investors, which they will be the employer in Africa, they were extremely concerned about the literacy of their workers. I wonder, according to your experience on that certain area, is it really important for the employees to be literate, or it is not really necessary for those simple jobs there? Is there any kind of misunderstanding for those future employers in Africa? Thank you.
Take one more, Dr. Richardson.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I always worry about alternative hypotheses and alternative interpretations of the data. So, and my experience, such as it is, was studying the household sector in Thailand several decades ago when Thailand was a less developed, low-income country. What I'm thinking is the possibility that the skills that are being taught in these programs not only are useful for wage employment, but might also be useful in the household sector or in small business contracting employment. And if so, that would explain at least some of the high turnover that these firms are experiencing, but it also might explain why you're not getting any significant differences in your results if people gain in the household sector rather than the wage employment sector. And it just might be, you know, are we looking at, you say you can't look at what the specific training is, but if it's not specific training, it can be used elsewhere, and the household sector is a candidate.
Well, if there's a third brief question at this point, we could take that. If not ready, then Juliet.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate here too, actually in Smith's class. I was wondering, you suggested that these large, like one way of like generating, I guess, demand for these skills in youth would be to have to ask the firms directly what skills they need, and then getting foreign, I guess, teachers who simultaneously, while creating job opportunities, are also teaching. I was wondering, because I know this this occurred to some extent with spillover effects in China, but I was wondering, like, how can very small and politically weak countries in terms of the international stage, like I don't know, Liberia or Gabon, how can they be expected to convince multinational corporations to train their workers in these skills that firms want?
Thank you. All right.
Yeah, okay, so let's start with Carmel's question and alternative hypotheses. So I think my argument is that the skills that are being, my hypothesis, my alternative hypothesis, is to the extent people are learning skills of value in these post-school technical and vocational training programs, they're learning the non-cognitive character skills. And or they may also be learning a little bit about business or whatever by having 3 months in a firm or 6 months in a firm. They may also be learning that. So that is my alternative hypothesis. And if I'm right, that's mostly what they're learning, and people are beginning to test that hypothesis now by doing various multi-arm study, then it's a lot cheaper. There are a lot cheaper ways to do that. There is a whole set of programs called positive youth development programs, you could call the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or 4-H or whatever, those kind of programs too. This Brock after-school program. And these are a lot cheaper than trying to put together a lab with equipment and people who know how to train on that equipment and whatever, and just focus on these non-cognitive character skills. And, there's some evidence for that. Well, okay, there's various different pieces of evidence for that. First of all, we know that these character skills are built up in you up until the age of 25. Like there's been this work on the brain and how the frontal cortex or lobe or whatever develops until you're 25 or 30 or whatever, and so people can continue to learn this stuff because that's where it's located apparently in your brain, and so there's a lot of different pieces of evidence. So my alternative hypothesis is the same skills that you need to get a job and keep a job, or the skills that you need to be a member of the participant in the community and be a good parent and a number of other skills, and that the problem is the school system is not teaching them because of the teaching methods. And we have a lot of evidence from the education side that the teaching methods that are too rote-oriented and not problem-oriented are not teaching those skills. So indeed, that is my alternative hypothesis. And that's why I think these are not showing a big result or in various ways. So if that's your alternative hypothesis, that's also mine. I have only pieces of evidence for it. I don't think I could come up with a full piece of evidence. Many of these positive youth development programs do not test for employment outcomes. So USAID also paid for a study of these positive youth development programs, and they test for things like, so this is another made-up review, they test for things like reproductive health outcomes and other kinds of happiness outcomes and, drug use outcomes and other things. But they don't test for employment outcomes. If they were to test for employment outcomes, my hypothesis is they would be good if they're getting these other outcomes. But again, we need that research. That'll take a few years. So I'm I'm not sure if that's your alternative hypothesis, but if your alternative hypothesis is the one that I'm thinking of, then I'm with you. Now on, okay, so there is an issue about Nicaraguan school graduates not being able to read. There's some pretty clear evidence on that. It's in the service delivery surveys been done by the World Bank. Do they need to read? Well, I think it depends on what the factory's producing. So that's more of a context-specific one. But I'm not surprised by the Chinese investors being worried about whether people learned anything in school. There's another problem, though, they might also worry about, which is that the people who say they want a job might quit shortly after they get the job because they don't know what a factory job is. And they go to a factory job and they do it for a couple of days. They say, God, I don't like this at all. I'd like to go back and start a business, or farm work is better than this, or whatever, right? And that's, of course, what Chris Blattman and Stefan Durkin found in Ethiopia. I think again, now what kind of skill is that? That's not reading and that's not vocational skills. And you don't need to go to school for 6 or 9 months to learn whether you like factory work. You could just go to some factory for 2 weeks and find out if you like factory work. If you showed up every day and you did the factory work, then and you know what that's called? That's called a temp agency that does that kind of stuff, right? Think about that. That's what a temp agency does, is it teaches you some of those going to work skills, right? Okay, so foreign trade, okay, I might have skipped a step in my argument. I was kind of the argument that I constantly hear from people, especially those practitioners, is, but the firms say that they can't find workers and these jobs would go unfilled, so we need to do these programs. Okay, well, I think the evidence is that urban labor markets work pretty well. The jobs aren't going unfilled that much. You need to, if there's an area with a big vacancy rate, and it has to do with skills training, and a lot of that has to do with things like ICT or like health skills, really specific higher level skills, then we can talk about the training and who should pay for it and how it should be done, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the reasons that firms, so there are two reasons that firms say they can't find the workers. One, a lot of it has to do with these transferable skills, because we have a lot of evidence that firms will train and that they do train if they think it's going to pay off because somebody's going to stay. But they also say we need experienced X, Y, and Z. And so the practitioners come back to me and say, but the firms say they need experienced pipe fitters, like in the mining industry or whatever. I'll bet they do. I'll bet they do. And I bet they're hard to find in rural Tanzania or rural Mozambique or rural Nigeria, right? I bet they're hard to find. But the question then is, what is the solution? A big training program set up by an NGO or a donor, or is there a deal that can be made with a firm? And I guess what I would say is when there's a mining concession, there's a trade-off, okay? How much revenue is the government getting in terms of mineral rents versus what else the firm can pay in kind, which includes training? And a lot of these contracts with mining companies, for example, are increasingly doing that kind of thing. So I think that's the kind of, yeah, it's tough for a smaller country to make that bargain, but what I would say is to the extent that people think that that is holding back, people argue that's holding back FDI, I would say let's solve that in another way.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one or maybe two questions. If there's any burning questions remaining, we can address those. And if not, let me, if I might just ask one more question, very brief question. So one thing that you've done that's really quite impressive in reviewing the 100 plus firms, something that's needed is look thoroughly at the supply side and at the demand side rather than just in a fragmented way. You know, going perhaps slightly more deeply, sometimes there may be some complementarities between these two sectors, such as might emerge, perhaps not in a low-income country, but you know, even as you sort of knock on the door to lower middle income status with industrial districts, which can be producing fairly basic kinds of products, but in which some coordination is needed because I'm not sure if it's the pipe fitters or whatever, but the workers want to get skills and locate in a place where there are firms that need their skills, and the firms want to locate where those workers are. So that raises some kind of a coordination problem between the two. And one thing I'm wondering is whether any of the studies that you've examined might have considered that possibility, or if you have any other reflections on it.
So I saw an interesting response to a coordination problem that was happening, but I don't think that, but it doesn't have an impact evaluation. And this was a DFID project, which was, so one of the, you know, this problem that has been documented with these, for example, with these Ethiopian firms, but I've heard it in other places, where like 80% of the workers leave after the first week. And so DFID in Ethiopia, for one of these industrial parks, these Chinese-run industrial parks, is setting up an intake center. and they test literacy, and they also have put the people in a room and show them a sewing machine, and they give them an idea of what a factory is like, and they give them a sewing test or something, and they give them a couple lectures on hygiene, and that you have to show up every time and whatever. And then they do a few more things, but like they work with the workers for about a week, okay? And the ones who passed all those hurdles then are placed in a list, right? And the firms all hire off of that list. So they have kind of the coordination problem. They have solved it for the firms. And, that's my point, is that temporary agencies solve that coordination problem for us, right? And so there may be scope for more of those things. That project that where the person spends a week costs a lot less than projects that spend 6 months teaching someone to sew or something. So I think that we need to look for some lower cost solutions. We need to try them out. I found the apprenticeship matching, which was another coordination problem solution in Ghana, which was evaluated by Isaac Mbiti and an ex-Berkeley student whose name is escaping me. Very interesting as well, especially it didn't get displacement. And what Ghanaian firms do is they make you pay for the first few months of an internship as a way of weeding out who's not going to show up. And that disadvantages lower income youth. And so this one instead made them come to about 3 sessions where they got some tests and they got some orientation or whatever. And the fact that they were willing to come to 3 of these sessions pretty much showed that they were willing to go to work, and then they matched them with the firm. So they had a different alternative to having somebody pay to measure, right, an unobservable character skill. There was another experiment. Where was that done? Was that South Africa, where they actually gave them a soft skills test and gave them some certification? It was presented at the ISA conference last month. And again, another solving an information coordination problem that seemed to have worked, and I can't remember all of the ones with it. So I think there's a scope for some cheaper interventions to solve some of those problems, and that's where we ought to be looking.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, it certainly matches, in your first example in particular, the idea of shared intermediate inputs and shared infrastructure in a very elastic sense in an industrial district as being part of what makes it work. So that's really quite an interesting insight. Well, that brings us to exactly 7:30. So we will wrap up here. And I hope everybody will stay for refreshments and conversation and networking. But on our way there, I hope that you will all join me in giving Dr. Fox a very hearty thank you.
Thank you.